Elias Boone stood on that dusty platform waiting for a ghost. Not the kind that rattles chains in the dead of night. The kind that was supposed to arrive on the 3:15 train from back east, with a little tag pinned to her dress that read, Bride. His two little girls, Nora and Beth, clung to his coat, their faces tight with a hope so fragile he was afraid the Dakota wind might just blow it away. The house had been a hollow, aching thing since their mother passed. He told them a woman was coming to help fill the silence. He just hadn't told them she'd be bringing a silence of her own. The men at the freight office had already made their jokes. A widower so desperate he'd send off for a woman who couldn't even speak her own name. The town's women just shook their heads, their pity like a cloak he didn't want to wear. But the ranch was failing, and his girls were growing up wild without a woman's touch. He'd do anything for them. Even this. The train hissed its final breath, the last of the passengers stepping down into the harsh afternoon sun. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. Maybe he was a fool. Maybe this was a mistake that would break what little was left of his family. Then she appeared. A slender figure, her bonnet pulled so low you couldn't see her face, just the line of her jaw set like stone. She didn't carry a suitcase full of hopes and dreams. She carried a battered old slate board, its surface gray with the ghost of 1,000 erased words. A tag was pinned to her coat, just as the letter promised. Marielle. The crowd stared. Some of them snickered. But Elias saw the tremor in her hands as she clutched that slate. He knew that kind of fear. The kind that lives in your bones. She went to the platform clerk, who barked out, Name? She just stood there, frozen. His face soured with impatience. Can't you hear me, girl? What's your name? She didn't answer, not with her voice. Instead, she lifted her pale, trembling hands. She moved them slowly, deliberately, her fingers sweeping against her chest, in a gesture that was both strange and beautiful, like she was gathering something invisible from the air and pulling it into herself. The clerk just scowled and waved her off, disgusted. But Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, but he understood. In the simple, graceful curve of her hands, he saw a word. Home, he whispered, the sound swallowed by the wind. Her head snapped up. Her gray eyes, wide and startled, locked with his. For the first time, he saw her face. It was younger than he expected, and etched with a sadness so deep it looked like it had been carved there. He felt a sudden, crazy urge to protect her from every harsh word, every cruel stare in this town. So he did the only thing he could think of. He raised his own calloused, clumsy fingers and copied the motion she had made. The world went quiet. The hissing steam, the shuffling boots, the whispers of the crowd. It all just faded away. There was only the space between them, a man and a woman who had never met, sharing a single, silent word. A tiny, soundless gasp escaped Marielle's lips. The fear in her eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of something else, something that looked like a soul that had been screaming in silence, finally being heard. He ignored the jeers of the townsfolk as he stepped forward and held out his hand. She flinched, clutching the slate board to her chest like a shield. Elias saw it then, on the worn wooden back of the slate. It wasn't smooth. There were marks scratched into the wood. Fine, deliberate lines that looked almost like a map or some kind of symbol. He squinted, trying to make it out, but she shifted, hiding it against her body. What was she hiding? She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Then, slowly, she placed her small hand in his. Her skin was cool, and a fine layer of chalk dust transferred to his palm, a ghost of all the words she couldn't say. His daughters crept closer, their eyes wide. "Papa," Nora whispered. "What did she say?" Elias crouched down, never letting go of Marielle's hand. "She said home," he told them, his voice thick. And in that moment he knew it wasn't just a word for her. It was a promise. a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, because as he led her toward the wagon, he couldn't shake the feeling that the silence she carried was filled with secrets, and the symbol on her slate felt less like a mark and more like a brand. The ride back to the ranch was thick with a new kind of silence. It wasn't the empty, grieving silence his house had known for a year. This was a fragile, watchful quiet, stretched thin between him, his daughters, and the strange woman sitting stiffly on the wagon bench. The whispers of the town were behind them, but Elias could still feel their sting. Fool's wife, mute, useless. He gripped the reins until his knuckles were white. He had to break this tension. He had to know if there was a person inside that silence, or just fear. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was his late wife Sarah's locket. He hadn't looked at it in months. He pressed the cool metal into Nora's hand. "Show her," he murmured. Nora opened the locket, revealing the tiny, faded portrait of their mother. Marielle leaned in, her eyes tracing the lines of Sarah's face. She didn't smile, but a softness moved across her features. Then her eyes widened, a flicker of something that wasn't just sympathy. It was recognition. It was gone as fast as it came, replaced by a deep, shimmering sadness, as she lifted a hand to her own chest, a gesture he didn't understand. But Elias saw it. He was sure he saw it. Why would this stranger recognize his dead wife? He pushed the thought away. It was madness. Grief playing tricks on him. He reached across the bench, his rough fingers gently touching hers. He moved them again in the shape she'd made at the station. Home. She looked at him, her gray eyes searching his, and then she pressed her palm against his for a heartbeat, a silent seal on their strange bargain. The girls saw it, and Beth, the youngest, whispered, "She's nice, Papa." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a real smile touched Elias's lips. But as the sun bled across the prairie, casting long skeletal shadows, he saw the distant shape of his ranch house, and he knew the welcome waiting there would be colder than any Dakota winter. His neighbors were hard people with long memories. A silent bride was a story they would sharpen their teeth on. He guided the wagon through the gate, the wheels creaking a weary song. He looked over at Marielle, who was watching his girls with a tenderness that made his heart ache. He made a vow, then and there. He didn't know what secrets she carried or why she looked at his wife's picture with the eyes of a ghost. But he knew this fragile quiet was better than the lonely noise he had before, and he would fight to keep it. He just didn't know the fight was already on his doorstep. The next morning the air was still cool when Marielle stepped onto the porch with a basket of laundry. She moved with a quiet purpose that was already starting to soothe the jagged edges of his home. Nora had braided her hair, a clumsy, childish attempt that Marielle wore like a crown. In that moment, watching her, Elias felt a dangerous spark of hope. Then he heard the crunch of wagon wheels on gravel. It was too early for visitors. Unless they weren't visitors. 3 of his neighbors. 2 ranchers, Jed and Marcus, their faces hard as granite, and Jed's wife, Martha, who folded her arms like she was holding back the wrath of God. They didn't come for coffee. They came for a verdict. Jed spoke first, his voice loud, every word a deliberate stone aimed at Marielle. "Have you gone mad, Boone, bringing this thing into your home? A woman who can't even hear your children cry in the night," Martha chimed in, her voice thin and sharp. "A ranch needs a woman's voice. Silence is a curse." His daughters shrank back, grabbing fistfuls of Marielle's dress. But Marielle didn't move. She just set the laundry basket down, her back straight, her eyes fixed on them. She was still clutching that slate board. Elias felt a hot, familiar rage coil in his gut, the same rage he'd felt in the war. He stepped forward, putting himself between her and them. He lifted his hand, his fingers fumbling, and made the sign for home. They laughed, a short, ugly sound. But then Marielle lifted her slate. Her hand was shaking, but the words she scrawled were sharp and clear. I can cook, I can clean, I can teach, I can love. What else does a home need? She held it high, a silent defiance that stunned them into silence. Then Nora, emboldened, shouted, "We want her! She's ours now!" Beth echoed her, her little voice piercing the tense air. "She's ours!" The laughter died. The certainty in their eyes flickered. They hadn't come here to fight children. They exchanged uneasy glances, then turned and left, muttering about shame and what the town council would have to say about it. The battle was over, but Elias knew the war had just begun. He turned to Marielle. She was watching him, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She lifted her hand and traced the sign for "thank you" into his palm. He caught her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, and pressed it to his chest. He couldn't say the words she deserved. Not yet. But he knew, right then, that his silence was finally starting to speak the same language as hers. That night, as he banked the fire, he saw it again. Marielle was wiping her slate clean, and for a split second, in the flickering lamplight, he saw the symbol on the back. It was a circle with a jagged line through it, like a broken sun. The same symbol he'd seen at the station. He opened his mouth to ask, but she turned the slate over, her face a smooth, unreadable mask. The question died on his lips. One battle at a time, he told himself. But a cold dread trickled down his spine. The threats from his neighbors felt simple. This symbol, this secret, this felt like something else entirely, something far more dangerous. The house changed. The hollow ache was replaced by the soft scrape of chalk on slate, the shuffle of little feet, and the silent, shoulder-shaking laughter of his girls as they tried to copy Marielle's hands. She gathered them at the kitchen table every afternoon, her head bent close to theirs, patiently guiding their clumsy fingers into the shapes for water, bread, play. She was opening a world for them he never could have, a world without sound but full of meaning. Elias would watch from the doorway, his arms crossed, a strange tightness in his chest. He saw his daughters smile in a way they hadn't since Sarah died. It was a brightness born not of being cared for, but of discovery. Marielle was not just a housekeeper. She was a teacher. She was a light. One afternoon she turned and saw him watching. She picked up her slate and wrote, "Do you want to learn?" She held it up, a small, challenging smile on her lips. He was a rancher, a man of calloused hands and few words. The idea of sitting there, fumbling with this delicate language, made him feel like a fool. But Beth ran to him, tugging his hand, her eyes pleading. So he sat. He felt huge and awkward at the big kitchen table, his fingers refusing to bend the right way. But Marielle was patient. She'd take his hand in hers, her touch sending a jolt through him, and gently correct his form. She showed him father. She showed him daughter. Then she pressed her own hand to her chest, over her heart, and pointed at him. Her eyes held his, daring him to understand. His breath caught. The girls gasped. "Papa," Nora whispered in awe. "She said you're in her heart." He didn't know what to do. He could only swallow hard and nod, the warmth in the room swelling until the silence itself felt loud with everything he couldn't say. But outside, the world was still watching. The whispers from town had grown into a low, angry murmur. He had defied them. He had chosen this silent woman. And this town did not forgive defiance. 2 days later, the murmur arrived on horseback. Elias was mending a fence when he saw the rider, a single shadow growing longer in the afternoon sun. It was Sheriff Brody, his badge winking like a malevolent eye. Elias knew this wasn't a social call. He put down his tools and walked to the house, his gut clenching. Marielle was in the yard with the girls, showing them how to sign the names of different flowers. She looked up, saw the sheriff, and all the light drained from her face. She grabbed the girls and her slate and hurried inside. It wasn't just caution. It was raw, animal fear. The sheriff dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth like hammers. "Boone," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "The town council has received a formal petition. Concerns have been raised." "Concerns about what, Sheriff?" Elias asked, his voice flat. "About her," Brody said, jerking his chin toward the house. "A mute woman is not a fit guardian for children. It ain't right. It ain't lawful. They say she's a curse on this valley." Before Elias could answer, the door opened. Marielle stood there, her knuckles white where she gripped her slate. She had heard nothing, but she had felt the threat. She held the slate up, her writing a furious scrawl. "I am not deaf to love. I am not mute to God." The sheriff sneered. "Clever tricks with a chalkboard won't change the law. The council's meeting on Sunday. They'll vote to have her removed, for the good of the children." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You send her away before then, Elias, and this all goes away. You don't... Well, folks around here have a way of dealing with curses." He gave Elias a long, hard look, his eyes cold and empty. Then he turned his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and menace hanging in the air. Elias's blood ran cold. This wasn't just prejudice. This was a coordinated attack. They were going to take her from him. He turned to go inside to reassure her, but he stopped dead. Marielle was leaning against the door frame, her body trembling. Her slate had fallen to the porch floor. She was staring after the sheriff, her face a mask of pure terror. She wasn't just afraid of being sent away. She was afraid of him. She knew him. He walked over and picked up the slate. He was about to write something, anything to comfort her, when he saw the back of it again. The strange symbol, the broken sun, and beneath it, so faint he'd never noticed it before, was a single word carved into the wood. A name. Corbin. The week that followed was a siege. Neighbors who used to wave now rode past his fence lines slow, their eyes lingering on the house with open hostility. Twice he found stones on his porch with words like "witch" scrawled on them. One morning a chicken lay dead by the gate, its neck broken. A clear, brutal warning. Elias wanted to ride into town and find the man responsible, to feel the crack of his knuckles against a jaw. But he looked at Marielle, moving through his house with a quiet grace, her hands teaching his daughter's prayers they signed at the dinner table, and he knew violence would only make things worse. He poured his fury into his work, fixing fences that weren't broken, chopping wood until his shoulders screamed. He was building a fortress against the hate. Inside that fortress, Marielle was building a home. She seemed to know that fear was a poison that could seep through walls, so she filled every corner with warmth. The smell of baking bread, clean laundry, wildflowers in a jar on the table. She was fighting back with the only weapons she had, love and labor. One night, Elias overheard the girls whispering. Nora said she thought their real mama had sent Marielle to them from heaven. Only God, she'd said, could find someone who doesn't talk but makes everything feel like a song. The words hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The danger sharpened on Friday. Elias was in the feed store when Jed and Marcus cornered him. "You got till Sunday, Boone," Jed said, his voice low and ugly. "She's gone by then, or we make her go." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elias's hands curled into fists, but he thought of his girls, of Marielle's terrified face when she saw the sheriff. He turned and walked away, their laughter chasing him out the door. He didn't have to say a word when he got home. She saw it on his face. She took her slate, her hand trembling so badly she could barely write. One word. Go. She was willing to leave, to walk back into the wilderness, to protect them, to protect him. Something inside Elias broke. He took the chalk from her fingers. He pressed her hand flat against his own chest, over his heart. And he wrote the word "stay" directly onto his shirt, the white chalk a stark vow against the dark fabric. The girls, watching with wide, frightened eyes, started making the sign for "stay" over and over, a silent, desperate chorus. That night Elias sat in a chair by the window, his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness. The world had drawn a line in the dust, and his family was on the wrong side of it. Marielle came and sat on the floor beside him, not touching him, just being there. Her presence was a comfort, but it couldn't erase the cold knot of fear in his stomach. He wasn't just fighting his neighbors anymore. He was fighting something bigger, a secret that had followed her here. He thought of the name carved into her slate, Corbin. He had to know. He turned to her in the darkness. "Marielle," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "Who is Corbin?" She flinched as if he'd struck her. Her eyes filled with a fresh wave of terror. She shook her head, her hands flying up in a flurry of signs he didn't understand. A silent, frantic "no." She scrambled up and fled to her room, leaving him alone with his rifle and a name that felt like a death sentence. He now knew for certain. Her silence wasn't a condition. It was a prison, and the warden was coming for her. The storm broke just after midnight. Not with thunder and lightning, but with the muffled thud of hooves on dirt and the bobbing, dancing lights of a dozen lanterns. They were coming. Jed, Marcus, and a pack of others, their faces twisted by cheap whiskey and self-righteous fury. Their voices cut through the night. "Send out the witch, Boone. We won't have a curse in this valley." Elias stood on the porch, the rifle feeling heavy and cold in his hands. Inside, he could hear the floorboards creak as Marielle hurried the girls into the back room. He could feel her fear through the walls of the house, a frantic vibration that mirrored the pounding of his own heart. Jed strode forward, spitting into the dirt. "The council has spoken, Elias. She ain't welcome here. Send her out now and we'll let you be." "There's been no council meeting," Elias said, his voice ringing out, steadier than he felt. "And no man tells me who belongs under my roof." "She has bewitched you," another man shouted. "Her silence is the devil's work." The standoff stretched, the air crackling with menace. Then the front door creaked open. Marielle stepped out. She was pale, her eyes huge in the lantern light, but she stood tall. She held her slate up, the chalk marks a defiant slash of white in the darkness. "I am no curse. I am love." Nora and Beth rushed out behind her, grabbing her skirts. They were crying, but they lifted their small, shaking hands and made the signs she had taught them. Mother, stay, home. The sight of the children, so small and so fierce in their silent devotion, gave the mob pause. Their certainty wavered. A few of the men in the back shuffled their feet, their eyes dropping to the ground. Jed's face purpled with rage. "It's a trick, the devil's own trickery." But the hesitation was enough. Elias raised the rifle. "This is my home," he said, his voice shaking with a fury that was cold and absolute. "She is my heart. The first man who takes another step will find I have nothing left to lose." The threat, raw and real, finally broke their nerve. They exchanged glances, the whiskey courage draining out of them. Muttering curses and threats about what the real council would do, they mounted their horses and retreated back into the darkness. Elias lowered the rifle, his body trembling with adrenaline. Marielle stepped toward him. Her slate lay forgotten on the porch. She reached up, her cool fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Then, with a touch as soft as a prayer, she spelled a word against his skin with her finger. Husband. The air left his body in a rush. He stared at her, this silent, mysterious, courageous woman. The town had declared her a curse. His own heart had just declared her his wife. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as the girls clung to them both. He had won the battle, but as he looked out into the hostile darkness, he knew Sheriff Brody and the town council were still coming, and their weapons wouldn't be lanterns and threats. They would be the law, and the law could be far crueler. The next 2 days were the quiet before a hurricane. A young rider, one of the men from the mob, showed up at his gate the next morning, his hat in his hands and shame in his eyes. He said his own mother had been deaf, and he'd never forgiven himself for not defending her from the town's cruelty. He'd come to warn Elias. The council meeting on Sunday wasn't just a formality. The sheriff had already drawn up the papers. They were going to declare Marielle unfit, make her a ward of the county, and send her to an asylum back east. An asylum. The word was a death sentence. Elias felt the axe handle in his hand creak under his grip. He wanted to burn the whole town to the ground. The young man, whose name was Thomas, said not everyone agreed with the sheriff, but people were scared. He urged Elias to bring Marielle to the meeting. Let them see her, he said. Don't let them judge a ghost. Elias hated the idea of parading her in front of that pack of wolves, but Marielle, who had come out onto the porch, seemed to understand everything. She took her slate and wrote, "I will go. I am not afraid." She held it high, and Thomas bowed his head to her as if she were a queen. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his late wife's locket. He kept replaying that moment in the wagon, the flicker of recognition in Marielle's eyes. It didn't make sense. Sarah had never left the valley, except for one trip, a month before she died. She'd gone to visit a cousin in a town called Red Creek, a town 100 miles from anywhere Marielle could have come from. He opened the locket. Sarah's kind face looked up at him. On an impulse he couldn't explain, he used the tip of his knife to pry at the edge of the portrait. It lifted up, and underneath it, tucked away for over a year, was a tiny folded piece of paper. His hands shook as he unfolded it. It was a letter from Sarah to her sister, one she must have started but never sent. Her looping script filled the small page. "I have to tell you what I saw in Red Creek. It is a terrible thing. The Corbin family owns this town, body and soul. I saw Mr. Corbin's son do a monstrous thing, and the lawman here, a man named Brody, he just covered it all up. I fear for the girl who saw it too. They will not let her live to speak of it. Brody, Corbin, Red Creek." The air turned to ice in his lungs. It wasn't a coincidence. Sheriff Brody wasn't just a bigot trying to enforce the town's prejudice. He was a man with a secret to bury. And Marielle wasn't her name. She was the girl from Red Creek. The witness. Her silence wasn't a curse. It was a shield, and it was about to break. He looked up from the letter. Marielle was standing in the doorway, watching him. Her eyes were wide with terror. She had seen the letter in his hand, seen the names, and she knew. He knew. The time for secrets was over. He walked toward her, holding out the fragile piece of paper. He didn't have to say a word. Her face crumpled, and a single soundless sob shook her entire body. Through a frantic storm of signs and chalk-scrawled words, the truth finally came out. Her name was Lena. Her family had been sharecroppers on the Corbin ranch. She had seen the youngest Corbin's son kill a stable hand in a drunken rage, and she had seen Sheriff Brody take a bag of gold to call it an accident. The Corbins had hunted her. She'd fled, changing her name, taking a vow of silence because her voice was a death sentence. She had answered his ad for a bride because the Dakota Territory seemed like the edge of the world, a place where no one would ever find her. But Brody had found her. He hadn't come to this town by chance. He'd been sent by the Corbins to find the one loose end, to find Lena and silence her for good. The town council, the petition, the asylum, it was all a lie, a legal way to kidnap and murder her. Just as the last, horrible piece of the puzzle clicked into place, they heard it. The sound of riders. Not a mob this time. A small group moving with quiet, deadly purpose. Elias ran to the window. It was Brody, and three other men he didn't recognize. Hired guns. They weren't coming for a meeting. They were coming to finish the job. Sunday came with the glint of sun on a rifle barrel. The whole town was crammed into the church, the air thick with judgment and anticipation. Sheriff Brody and the council sat at the front, their faces grim and self-satisfied. They thought this was already over. Then Elias walked in. His shoulders were back, his head was high. His daughters clung to his hands. And beside him, walking with a calm, steady grace, was Marielle. Her name was Lena, but she was his Marielle. She wore a simple dress, her hair was neatly braided, and she held her slate to her chest like a shield of honor. A wave of whispers washed over the pews. But she didn't flinch. She walked right to the front and stood before them, her eyes clear as water. Brody stood up, a smug smile on his face. He began his speech, his voice booming with false piety, talking about protecting the innocent, about the dangers of an unfit guardian, about the curse of silence. But before he could get to the verdict he'd already decided on, Marielle lifted her slate. Her hand did not tremble. The chalk did not squeak. Her words were a testament. My silence is not a weakness. It was my shield. This man, your sheriff, is not a man of law. He is a murderer's errand boy. He came here to silence me because I am the only witness to a crime committed by the Corbin family of Red Creek. A crime he helped bury for a bag of gold. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Brody's face went from smug to sheet white in a heartbeat. Lies, he roared, the ravings of a damaged mind. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Then Nora's small, clear voice cried out, "She's not lying. She's our mama now." Beth climbed onto the pew, her little hands forming the signs for mother and love and home. The crowd was in an uproar. Before Brody could regain control, Elias stepped forward. His voice was low, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. "My late wife, Sarah, saw it too," he said, holding up the fragile letter. "She wrote about it just before she died on that road from Red Creek, a death that was ruled an accident by a lawman who was never found." He locked eyes with Brody. "The truth has a long memory, Sheriff." The dam of lies broke. Thomas, the young rider, stood up. "My mother was deaf," he shouted. "She wasn't a curse. She was a good woman, and so is this one." Others started to murmur their agreement, shame and anger warring on their faces. They had been lied to. They had been used. Brody, cornered and exposed, drew his pistol. "This is official council business," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I am the law here." "Not anymore," Elias said. He didn't have a gun. He just stood there, a rancher protecting his family. And in that moment, the entire town stood with him. The men on the council, realizing they'd been made fools of, turned on Brody. The ranchers who had threatened him with lanterns now stood between him and Marielle. The lawman was suddenly a man alone. He looked from face to angry face, saw there was no escape, and let the gun clatter to the floor. It was over. As the townsfolk led Brody away, his threats and curses swallowed by the murmur of a community finding its conscience, Elias led Marielle and the girls out into the bright afternoon sun. He turned to her, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. He gently took the slate from her hands and set it on the church steps. "You won't be needing this anymore," he said softly. "Not unless you want to." He looked into her eyes, the gray eyes that had seen so much horror and held so much strength. "I don't need the town's permission. I don't need a preacher. Lena, Marielle, will you be my wife?" Tears streamed down her face, washing away the chalk dust and the years of fear. Slowly she lifted her hands. She didn't sign yes. She signed home. Then she pressed her palm to his chest and signed forever. The girls cheered, dancing around them in the dust. Elias pulled her close, his lips finding hers, sealing a vow that needed no words, no paper, no laws. It had been forged in silence, tested by fire, and was now, finally, free. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sound of his daughter's laughter. He knew there would be talk, there would be healing to do in the valley. But for the first time, his house, his family, was truly whole. And its foundation was a silence that was stronger and louder than any word ever spoken. If you enjoyed this story of courage and love against all odds, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Now, we have to ask, if you were in that church and all you knew was that she was a silent stranger, would you have had the courage to stand up for her? Let us know your honest answer in the comments below.